So we have a man here today who's been telling us who we really are, for better or worse, for the last year and a half. You'll know his voice from the radio and know his face from the TV, telling us surprising things about ourselves that upended a lot of conventional wisdom. And I was delighted when he agreed to come down to Galway and talk at more length, because in radio interviews, TV interviews, you get maybe 10 minutes if you're lucky, 15 if you're very lucky. So we have a full hour of him today, which means we're going to learn a great deal more about who we actually are. And to interview him, that's Pete Lunn sitting behind me here. To interview him, we have Katie Hannon, who's one of Ireland's best-known journalists and radio presenters. She's had a very long career with RTÉ, and she's created a reputation for empathy and quiet doggedness when dealing with difficult interviewees. She does live lines sometimes to stepping in for Joe Duffy, and it's a very different show when it's her doing it. She has a quieter approach, she's softer, and she often gets more out of the people who ring in than Joe might. And we all love second captains and want to hear who's the best non-sports person, sports person. I went on it myself and insisted they give me 0 because I had 0 interest in sport, but they gave me ridiculously high marks for being in love with George Best when I was a teenager. That doesn't qualify in my view. Anyway, they're going to go, and next Saturday?
Next Saturday.
Katie's going to be back at 1 o'clock, and the following Tuesday we're going to have the late debate every night. So those of us who are junkies for news and politics are going to have a very happy time. And the other thing about Katie is she's got one of those memories like Marion Finucane's, where if somebody says something that they said the opposite of 10 years ago, she'll know that, which is a very frightening thing, where people are constantly reinventing themselves. She'll say, no, hang on a minute, that's not what you said then. Wouldn't like to go up against her. So please welcome Katie Hannon and Pete Lunn.
Thank you very much, Katrina. I want to bring you to every social setting I'm ever in the future, so you can just introduce me ahead of me having to meet anyone. Pete Lunn, delighted to finally get a chance to meet you in person. I've been listening to you, like Katrina, over the last 18 months and hanging on your every word. But I think a lot of people mightn't realise the very scenic route you took to getting to run this team in the ESRI on behavioural science. Just talk us through that.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I guess I come from a family of nerds. I have 2 mathematicians for parents. I went off and did a PhD in visual neuroscience by the time I was 24. Very much a kind of nerdy science guy. But I studied experimental psychology and neuroscience because I was fascinated by people more than mathematics, like the rest of the family. My sister went off to do maths as well. And when I got to the end of that, I'd become fascinated by the way science and public affairs and our understanding of ourselves interfaced, if you like. And I was the black sheep of the family. I left academia and went into journalism. And I worked at the BBC for the guts of 10 years.
They must have been devastated, were they?
It was somewhat disapproved of until, of course, you know the way parents are. They disapprove of you making the radical choice until it works, and then they suddenly switch to being hugely proud. And I caught my dad, who didn't like me leaving academia at all at one point, speaking at a party about how I was doing terribly well at the BBC and all this kind of stuff. So that sort of, that kind of parental switch ride that I do with my own children now, I have to confess, was part of that. So yeah, I went and did that, and I specialised in primarily science. I worked on Newsnight for a while at the BBC in London. And all the time I was doing this, I got sick of losing arguments to economists. So there was a guy who was the Newsnight economics correspondent, who some people may know. He's often on Radio 4 now. He did the Today programme for a while. I think he's doing the PM programme, their afternoon programme now. So if anyone ever listens to UK radio, you hear him. There's a guy called Evan Davis. He's a brilliant economics journalist, and he used to kick me around the Newsnight office in arguments. I couldn't work out, I've got scientific training, I'm in public affairs, why is this guy kicking me around the office? So I actually went off and studied some economics. I spent 2 years doing a master's in economics while I was working on Newsnight, because I was young and single, I could do this. And I think from that moment on, I was always going to go back into research, because I realized that there was a really fertile ground about how we make decisions and how we behave that economists were studying pretty badly, that psychologists had a much better idea of, but that the economists got much more weight because they were economists, and everyone's sort of scared of them, and they're very quantitative. Whereas psychologists really struggle in the public space to get the attention I think they deserve, actually. But it's hard because people think psychology is a kind of soft science that doesn't really properly measure stuff or do proper science. And if you ever say to a politician, "Oh, I'm a psychologist," they'll sort of be quite dismissive. You know, you think you understand people, but I go to the trouble of getting elected and getting people to choose me. You know, why would I listen to you? Something, you know. But economists scare them, of course. If you go along and say, "I'm an economist," then suddenly the politician, damn, the numbers thing, the evidence thing, you know, they're actually quite frightened of it. So I discovered calling myself a behavioural economist is the perfect thing to do, right? Because I can then study behaviour and I can have the best of both worlds. But I actually have degrees in both psychology and economics. So it's a very circuitous route. I left journalism because I could see that studying behaviour and decision-making was going to change the way policies were made, the way a lot of big issues we face were going to be tackled in the future. So I left journalism and I went back into research. And
you ended up in the ESRI running this team.
And I ended up in the ESRI, and you say, well, you know, why is this English guy end up in the ESRI? I've been living in Dublin for nearly 20 years. And of course, the answer to why is this English guy end up in Dublin is a woman.
Of course.
So I met Una, and we saw each other across the water for a couple of years. And eventually, I decided I'd rather live in Dublin than she would in London. So, yeah, I've been here nearly 20 years now and not regret it for a minute. I love it here.
Okay. So tell me then, the pandemic arrives. Was it immediately apparent that, you know, you could have a role, behavioural science could have a role in managing outcomes?
I don't know, but we were very proactive about it. So the ESRI is a very funny place to work. So, you know, you're this national research institute who's trying to measure everything, watch everything. You know, we're supposed to run flags up poles when trouble's coming and we can see it in evidence. So you've got all these sort of group of kind of nerdy people who don't much like the limelight, but are constantly monitoring what's going on in the country. And as the pandemic arrived, it really reminded me of the feel of the financial crisis, where when we realized quite how deep and horrible that was going to be, how big the hole in the public finances were, how much trouble the banks were in, and the data was starting to make it apparent to everybody, there was this sort of real sense of, oh my God, this is huge, that started to descend upon the Institute. And I remember going to Alan Barrett, the director of the Institute's office, as the pandemic was arriving, and I just said, Alan, does this feel like the financial crisis to you? And he was like, yeah, that's what it feels like. And I said to him, look, I want my team to drop everything for a week and just write a review where we just go looking for evidence and we say, you know, what is there in behavioural science that can help? And I said, can I just have your permission to do this? And he said, yes, you should just do it. So we dropped all the work we were doing and we just dived into all of the behavioural science literature that we could find. There were about 6 or 7 of us who did this and wrote this review for a week. And this would be back right at the start of March of 2020. And we found there was hugely helpful stuff, right from the kind of practical stuff about how do you persuade people to wash their hands and how do you get them to improve their hygiene, all that kind of practical stuff we've all had to put up with, all that kind of thing. But the really, really important stuff was about how do you get people voluntarily to make really big sacrifices for the public good, because that's what you're going to have to do. If you've got this pandemic and we have this infection, so you are going to have to ask every citizen and say, look, please, please, please do this, because we've all got to do it, because we'll all be better off if we do. And we realized there was a really rich stream of behavioral literature all about how you try and solve these collective action problems and social dilemmas. These are what these things are called in the scientific literature. We realized that was all there, and we pulled it all together, and we wrote it in this review that got circulated in the Department of Health before, you know, we locked everything down, before the schools were shut, and we said, look, this is what's coming, this is what we think might help. Now, I've no idea whether us doing that made a huge difference or not, because one of the funny things about being in my business is, you know, you feed all the evidence into the system, it goes into the mill, you see what comes out the other end. You've no real idea how much influence your stuff had had. But I think in this case, it had quite a lot. And we were then called in for a whole series of meetings, and I ended up sitting on one of the committees that advised NPHET, and that was how it all...
That was from quite early on in the pandemic.
Yeah, and that was how it all started. But as soon as you get a conversation going, because of course there's a kind of scientific medical community there, as soon as you get a conversation going and people start to realize you're really a data person and you're really feeding in evidence, the system started to feed itself because everyone was so frightened. I mean, you know, sure, you think of... You're going into this big, powerful government department, but they're just people working in there. And they're looking at what's coming, and they're scared. And if someone's coming in and providing them with data and evidence and things they can make inferences from, then you're going to get pulled in. And that's what happened.
So they were basically clinging to you like the last lifeboat.
Well, no, I certainly wouldn't go as far as that. I'd be far more modest about it than that. There were lots of people being pulled in.
Yeah.
But what they're doing is they're looking around and saying, what resources do we have?
Yeah, and I suppose we have to cast our mind back to that time as well. We didn't have a vaccine, and at that point, they thought vaccine was many years away, actually, you know, for those first early months of the pandemic. So literally, the only tool that was available was somehow through information and the data that you're talking about, trying to manage how people behave and interact.
Yeah, absolutely. And we needed to set up systems immediately. So one of the really difficult things, and I cannot praise the Chief Medical Officer's office enough from this point of view, how rapidly Ireland actually got set up so we could gather data and evidence and see it coming in. Now, sure, we had what's called second mover advantage. I mean, we saw the horrible stuff that was going on in Italy. If you cast your mind back to that time, Italy was in terrible trouble, and the UK was starting to go as well. And we could see all of that, and we're just looking across the world, and Jesus, look at this. You know, and we pulled data together incredibly quickly at that time, and methods of getting it there, getting the right people. And I think Ireland had a huge advantage, and that's that we're small. And one of the things that meant was that people knew each other. They knew where the good people were. They knew where the people who could do different things were. And sometimes we worry about that because that's the same thing that makes us a bit nepotistic sometimes and makes, you know, human connection and friendships override maybe job titles and processes. And we worry about that, and of course we should. But when a global pandemic's about to wash over you, having that really tight community of people who know each other is really, really helpful. So just to give you a small example of that, I mean, I think we were trusted partly because we'd already done research on obesity for the Department of Health that they'd really liked, where we were looking at human behavior and food choice. And they knew our methods. They knew the kind of thing that we could do. They knew the kind of people we were, you know, what drove us. And that human connection was a really important thing. And I think one of the reasons why Ireland actually, if one can have a good pandemic, by international standards, actually our numbers are very good. I mean, we've suffered less than other countries. And I think one of the primary reasons for that is because we're a smaller community that could pull together.
Yeah, any other reasons for that? Because I heard you say that before. Do you think, you know, relatively speaking, we have had a good pandemic? Like, okay, so, but there's a lot of smaller countries that maybe haven't done as well. So what else?
There are. So here is something I wish I had written down or somewhere said publicly in March 2020, because the only evidence I have that I ever said it is in my own kitchen, and Una will say, yes, he said it before it happened, right? So I said back then when the whole thing was washing over, I said, you know, looking at this from a behavioural science point of view, what everyone is going to have to do is this thing where we all club together and we all make sacrifices for the public good, this collective action idea, that's what we've all got to do. And I said back then, what will happen here is countries that have a really strong sense of identity are going to do better. Because all of the behavioural research tells you that when you have groups that identify with themselves as a group, right, and we can show this in laboratory experiments, it's an amazing phenomenon actually. If you have a group that identify with each other, they have something in common, they have stronger identity, they will cooperate to solve problems better than other groups. They'll make sacrifices for the good of the group to solve problems together, the stronger their identity is. And I said, look, I know this from the behavioural science. It's a really powerful effect. And what I think this means is not just smaller countries are going to do better, but countries that have a really strong sense of identity will. And that's probably going to be particularly countries that are next to a large dominant neighbour.
Because that the force of that.
Because historically it gives you this huge sense of identity. And that's exactly what's happening.
Oh yeah, I'm thinking Portugal, Spain.
Right, so Portugal did better than Spain, Canada did better than the US, Denmark did better than Sweden and Germany, New Zealand did better than Australia, and we did better than our neighbouring island. Right, and I wish I'd said it as a prediction at the time.
Do you think we would get Una in here to just back you up on that?
I need my evidence base, yeah. So I think that was an awful lot of what helps for us. We have this very strong sense of identity. So much so that someone who comes from England like me ends up using the word we to describe it, having lived here 20 years, because I feel part of this community now. I mean, obviously more so from the pandemic and all that's happened.
You do understand you will always be a blow-in, though, don't you?
Oh, I do, I do. And I'm more than happy with that status, that's okay.
Okay, so you were plugged into this from the very beginning, and we talk a bit about that phase of the pandemic, and then the more recent phase, say from January, when we had the vaccines, we knew we were on this path then, and the information you have gleaned. Was there a shift, a big shift in what you saw, you know, in behaviours, and what was maybe perhaps the most surprising thing you saw when you started tracking people's behaviour?
So if we go back to the very first wave of the pandemic, actually we were brilliant. The levels of compliance were extraordinary, despite the fact that if you think about what that government order essentially was, to not travel more than 2 kilometres from your house for an extended number of weeks, and how few people you could see and all that, and it was an incredibly restrictive thing to ask people. We did brilliantly.
But again, is this tied into the way we respond to risk? Because we were pretty terrified at that stage.
Yeah, so this is what I was about to say. So a lot of that was about fear, and we were measuring that. We were tracking how frightened people were by the virus. And a lot of that was about fear. But as we got over the first wave, there was still huge optimism that that was going to be it. It's really hard to cast your mind back to that now. But at the time, people thought, oh, we're going to get over this wave, and by September, we'll be back to normal. You know, there was this real feel of there's a wave coming, it'll go. Of course, we now know much, much better. And actually, the public sussed that out faster than officialdom did, which is another fascinating behavioural thing. I can come back to that in a second if you like, if we go through chronologically. But initially what happened was, as we clearly had peaked and it was starting to come down, the government, having asked everyone to make these huge sacrifices, is now really, really worried about how long can we keep this up for. You know, we want to start lifting these restrictions and giving people freedoms, because we've constrained their freedom so much for 6-8 weeks. It was that kind of first period. And we were doing studies for them and showing them how people really thought and felt. And I still remember, actually, that one of the first ones we did was just before the restrictions were very first lifted in the middle of 2020. So if you cast your mind back to kind of early May 2020 or so, just at that time, we did a study where we ran an experiment. So it's important to understand that behavioural scientists like me, we don't just do surveys and ask people how they feel. We do a little bit of that. An awful lot of what we do is actually controlled experiments where we present information to people in different ways, and we see how they respond to each other, compared to each other in different groups. We might randomise somebody to see information one way, randomise someone to see information the other way, and then we compare the different responses. And we did a study just before we came out of the first wave where we were presenting different options for what the government would do next. So we mocked up government announcements. And we had, you know, imagine this is how we come out of this. And we mocked up the announcements, and we had people responding to these.
And just remind us, what phase, when would this have been?
So this was done in May 2020. So we just got to the top where the numbers had done this. Yeah. And we could see now that...
we're coming down over the peak,
yeah. So we can see now that we were on the way down and that we were going to start opening things up. And at that point, we ran this study, and we couldn't get over how frightened everybody was. That people were actually really not wanting the government to lift these restrictions very quickly. And if they were going to go quicker, they wanted the review period to be shorter. And they wanted them to be checking really carefully. And we showed this to the Department of Health. I still remember showing the kind of senior figures in the Department of Health, and they were amazed. They were looking, going, people still scared.
Yeah, because that struck me a number of times during this thing. Did the government and the department and the public health, the NPHET, you know, all that architect, did they underestimate people's, first of all, capacity to maintain the kind of restrictions, but also the level of fear that there was?
Yeah, not just them. I mean, the entire public debate did. And I think there's a whole bunch of reasons for this. I mean, one is that what we could see was the people who were taking the most risks. So the people you could see in the streets, the people who were not complying, the people who were out and about doing things. Yeah. You think it's everybody because it's what you can see. You don't see all the people who are at home, by definition. So the people who are the most scared and the most compliant are the people you don't see around you. So it's really hard to think that actually they're the majority of the population and they're just there, they're just staying at home. But I think there's other reasons as well, and one of them is your profession. So I found consistently throughout this that the media wanted restrictions lifted faster than the public. If by that I mean not the people who are really objectively just reporting, but the columnists, the people who are writing about it. And there was this constant idea that there was this pressure and everyone wanted to get back out and doing stuff really, really quickly. And all of our data was showing there was a small minority that wanted to do that. And my experience was the journalists tended to be in it.
and because there was that sense, absolutely, you know, you could track that easily if you went back and did an analysis of the journalism at the time. Did that push politicians in a particular direction?
Exactly. So the whole public debate actually underestimated how cautious people were. And that meant we had a role. Because my unit was consistently analysing data and saying, do you know what? You're going faster than the public want you to. So when we came out of that first wave, and this is a fascinating thing, when we came out of that first wave, the numbers started to fall. And we were tracking some of the data. And one of the questions that we were tracking really closely, because we thought was a good question, was people's response to, are we going too quickly, not quickly enough, about the right speed. And what we found as we went through that first year of the pandemic, May, June, July, you could see quite a lot of the public were worried we were going too quickly, right? But it was only marginally on the cautious side to start with. As soon as we got low case numbers, and then the numbers started edging up a little bit, the public swung much, much more quickly. It was like they got the message there was going to be a second wave far quicker than the media and officialdom did, and we were seeing it in the data. And we started saying, you know, the public think there's a second wave coming here, and they think we're going too fast. And that was even true back at the end of June.
Wow. So the public were following that data that was coming out on a daily basis in terms of figures, the public were hearing that and thinking, oh,
the public knew a second wave was coming and wanted something done about it. And it was fascinating actually to see that. So there's a phenomenon in science, and there's a very famous popular book about this called The Wisdom of Crowds. So when I say the public thought this, actually there's enormous diversity among the public in how they responded to this pandemic. And I want to, at some point, to talk about that. But I'm looking at them on average. And what was so interesting is you could see, on average, the public mood was shifting much, much more to this is going too fast. And we also track very closely throughout the pandemic people's level of overall personal worry about the virus. And it had bottomed out and it was starting to go up again. And the minute the case numbers rose even a little bit, it was really, really starting to go. And we could see that happening. So yeah, I thought it was a classic example of a wisdom of crowds thing, because you can be an expert, you can be a medical expert, you can be someone who claims to be a behavioural expert, you can be that, right? But the public have eyes and ears, and they could see what was going on around them. They could see how people were mingling, they could see what was happening. So when we average all of their opinions together, the phenomenon of the wisdom of crowds tells you, because it's such an efficient way to gather information, to ask thousands and thousands of people for their point of view, for something that is happening out and about, the aggregation of their views is going to be better than any one expert that's trying to look at it. And that's the wisdom of crowds phenomenon. And it happened. It happened in late June and July of 2020, where the public knew that second wave was coming faster than the experts did.
That's absolutely fascinating. But then, okay, so you're gathering the data, and it's fascinating, obviously, particularly if you were somebody like yourself who's nerdily, fascinated by how people respond to these things. But how do you use that data then to persuade people to, as you say, the thing you need to be able to do to manage a public health crisis is to persuade people to make sacrifices?
So that's where
and talk about the people that are difficult to persuade.
Yeah, so that's the amazing thing that I think hopefully we've all learned from this pandemic, which is that the large majority of us, the very large majority of us, will make personal sacrifices for the public good. And it is just phenomenal what people have done, not just in Ireland, but across the world. Now, we've done it better than most other places, but even wherever you go, you have this situation where the majority of people have made really unpleasant, emotionally difficult sacrifices for the common good in circumstances where they weren't going to get punished if they didn't. Or at least the chances they were very low. And actually, we've measured that. I mean, we measured what people thought the likelihood that they would get caught and punished for doing this was. And it had almost no impact on people's behaviour. The people who thought it was more likely don't behave differently from the people who don't. The deterrence effect was tiny. But of course, because it's day-to-day activity that can't be monitored.
So all that very, very public, guards stopping people on the road.
Well, I think the signalling of that's really important. I mean, people get a real sense, look, this is a hugely important national issue. If I've got guards stopping me and doing checkpoints, just asking me where I'm going, I mean, they were never going to enforce it. I mean, famously, the journalists were arguing like crazy and saying, but they've got no enforcement power. It doesn't matter. What they're actually signalling is this has to be a norm for how we behave, and officialdom is telling you that, and they're going to encourage you to do that. And it tells you that everyone else is doing it. It's a really important thing, because we only make those sacrifices if we think everyone else is doing it too. We don't want to be the mug that's doing it when other people are not. And that's one of the reasons why when there was non-compliance, it gets this huge public profile, right? And it's also why when Golfgate came along, we could see in our own data that people's compliance fell off as a result of Golfgate. It's actually a notch in the data that lasted about 2 or 3 weeks.
That was my next question. What actual measurable effect had Golfgate? As the biggest one?
So it did, not for very long. And that's really interesting, because what actually happens sometimes in those cases is the initial response is, why am I doing this if this group of elite people are not? Right, which is exactly what a behavioural scientist like me say is going to happen. So we will all cooperate for the public good if we can see everyone else is doing it. But if I see other people are not doing it, I might withdraw. And about half the population are what we call conditional cooperators. They'll cooperate for the public good, provided they see other people doing it. But if they see other people not doing it, they won't. And some of those conditional cooperators stopped being good if we want to call it that, doing the right thing by us all, right, after Golfgate. But what then happens, of course, is there's the public outcry. And the public outcry was so big and so persistent going after these people, right? As some of your colleagues know, and some other, right? It was so big. Actually, it then started to galvanize people. So there was a fall-off in behaviour that then came up again after 2 or 3 weeks, because what it actually teaches you is that the large majority of the population are doing the right thing, and they're outraged. So I'm not alone, right? You know? So in fact, you get this kind of notch in the data where it comes back up. And the other fascinating thing about these kind of collective action problems is this, that they only work if we can all see why it is, if we all club together, we get the right outcome. So for us to make those sacrifices, we have to be able to say, look, if I do this and everyone else does this, then I can see how it is we get to the promised land, we get to the place we need to be. And that's interesting too, because where it also started to get difficult was where people started to see contradictions, where they could see, well, hang on, I'm allowed to do this, but I'm not allowed to do that, and I'm allowed to do this. This isn't adding up. And where that happens, that also weakens people's willingness to do the cooperation, because you have to see why it is we all have to make the sacrifice, and if we all do it, we get to the right outcome. And if you see contradictions, you can't see why.
Yeah, and that was almost like a genre of itself in social media, which is, why can I do this but I can't do that? Why can they do that but I can't do this? It was a huge part. Every time a new set of restrictions would be released or put in place, there was inevitably going to be, you know, contradictions and you know, odd compliance things. I mean, even if we go to the most recent Marion Gate controversy. So that did as well undermine and as you say, you know, not take a notch at the legs under that kept this whole thing going.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can see that in the data really clearly, actually. So we now have a study that we've been doing since January where we monitor people's behaviour really, really closely. And people can do it on mobile phones, on tablets. It's completely anonymous. We ask them what they got up to in the last week.
And are they the same people every week, or do you?
No, it varies. So it's a fresh sample. Some people might repeat over a period of a few months, but it's essentially a fresh sample. And we ask 1,000 people every couple of weeks, and we analyse this data. And it's completely anonymous, and you just describe where you've been, how many people you've met. And we home in, we use a technique from behavioural science that's actually rather nice. It's called the day reconstruction method, where you get people to think about the day before, you think about yesterday, and it's like you think of yesterday as a series of episodes from a film. So we say to people, right, think of yesterday and start to put your episodes together. You know, you got up, what did you do in the morning? What did you do for lunch? What did you do in the afternoon? Think of it as a series of episodes from a film. And we get them to write it down as a series of episodes. And then we ask detail about each of the episodes. You know, how many people did you arrange to meet? How many people did you meet? And so on. So we got into this whole business of whether we could measure quite accurately how people had close contacts, how many people had they met, where had they been, what locations were they going back to, where were people more nervous, where were people not going to. But overall, how much risk were they taking as well? And when we started to model that data, we could see that there were certain things that were really important for how much risk people took. So just how worried they were was one of them. If you had a high level of personal worry, it makes sense, you're going to be more cautious. And it's really important to understand, we still live, even now, our latest data from a week or two ago, about 1/3 of the population at the moment sees no one from outside their household over a 48-hour period. Right, that's still true now.
Wow, today, 1/3 of the population.
Now that doesn't mean they're seeing nobody at any point, but over a 48-hour period, they might see someone during the week, but over a 48-hour period, they're not meeting up with anyone from outside their own house.
Semi-cocooning.
So we're a long way back, we're a long way from normal still. There's a lot of very nervous people out there.
Is that tied to age?
To some extent, but less than you might think. I'll come back to that in a second, because I just want to say what's really driving people's behaviour here. We can model it and we can see it. And one of the things is this idea of contradiction. If you can see that what's being asked of you is coherent, and we measure, we get to say, is the guidance, you know, do you find it really contradictory, or do you find it coherent? Do you find it easy to follow, hard to follow? How worried are you? We can see, if you're really worried, you're much more cautious. If you think the advice you're given is contradictory, you are less cautious. So actually, how consistent that advice is and how easy it is to follow as well are really important for whether people follow it. But the other thing is this. We have a question about essentially how selfish are people.
Yeah.
It's essentially what is more important to you, the burden of putting up with these restrictions or preventing the spread of this disease for everyone else. And we give people a scale, and they go where they are on the scale. And there's a group who are down the selfish end of that scale, and that variable is really powerful. You're much more likely to meet lots of people, have a close contact, go to a place you shouldn't, right? All of that, you are more likely if you're at that selfish end of that scale. And so it's fascinating to watch because I'm watching basically a giant country-sized lab, because we can run studies in the lab that show that those are the things that matter. And then here I am measuring on a kind of national scale with this pandemic, where I can see exactly the same things driving people's behavior.
And this isn't I mean, this is something that would have been proven in behavioural science going back decades, right?
About 30 or 40 years, yeah. So the first studies were run in the 80s and the 90s.
Okay, so how many people?
So it's roughly, it's roughly 1 in 7, 1 in 8. So if you, and this is what the behavioural scientists have done for the 30, 40 years, so I just should be clear about what this is. I mean, we would set up a laboratory experiment where, let me give you an example, it's really easy. Supposing we put a pot in the middle of the stage here, and we gave everyone here 10 €1 coins. Right? So everyone in the audience gets 10 €1 coins, and we say you can throw either all 10 of the coins in, just 1 coin, or no coins at all, right? However many coins go in the pot, I'm going to double it. Right? I stress this is a hypothetical experiment, okay? However many coins go in the pot, I'm going to double it, and then I'm going to divide them equally between everyone.
Okay.
Now, if you stop and think about that for a moment, what that means is if everyone puts all their coins in, everyone gets double the money. But for any one individual, if you really want to maximize your outcome, you don't put any coins in.
You still get one.
Right? And you still get all the ones that come out the pot.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a classic behavioural experiment. We've been running these things in the lab for 30, 40 years, right? Where do people contribute to the public good for everyone, or do they behave more selfishly and maximise their own outcome and free ride on everyone else's good behaviour? Right? It's called a public good game, by the way, if you ever look it up in scientific literature. They're fascinating things. And this is one of these games where we knew the stronger the group identity of the people who play the game, the more money they make. So where there's really strong group identity, they all cooperate, they all put the money in, and they all get the spoils. Right? So that's exactly the kind of thing I mean. Now, what we find is, roughly speaking, around 1 in 7, 1 in 8 people really struggle with these things. They just will not give their money for the public good. About 1 in 7, 1 in 8. It's a kind of personality thing. It hardly changes by gender. It hardly changes by age. It doesn't change by socioeconomic status at all. You know, it's much more like a personality thing rather than a what kind of social group do you come from thing. And there are some people who just really struggle to do it.
And through the pandemic, this held true, and that's interesting that your social economic background has no impact or very little impact on how you responded to the restrictions you were being
So
asked.
again, we could see in the data that if you looked at non-compliance for most kind of activities, it was sitting down around the kind of 5, 10, 15% mark, right? And you say, well, that's not 1 in 8, that's less than 1 in 8. And of course, the reason for that is punishment. Right? The reason for that is that the people who are behaving selfish are held in check by the rest of us. Now, you might think I've just contradicted myself because I said, look, you know, but there was no punishment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was no punishment from the state that really mattered hugely because your chances of getting caught were so small. The punishment's from your friends and family. It's social disapproval. The people we know to be the selfish people, the people who we know are in our lives who are a bit like that and don't necessarily do the right thing, they get so much peer pressure from the majority to do the right thing that they do anyway because it's not worth their while not to. And one of the things that's fascinating about that public goods game I just told you about is if we play that game in the lab with a pot of money for real money, right, and we introduce punishment whereby everyone finds out who put money in afterwards, right? So the social disapproval of the people who didn't contribute, well, contributions start to go up, right? because the selfish people get held in check. And that's exactly what was going on during the pandemic. That people who were misbehaving were getting held in check by the rest of us. And I was fascinated by some of it. I mean, going to the local supermarket, you know, someone was starting to get a little close to you because they were getting impatient and they wanted to get their cheese or whatever it was, and they moved too close. All you had to do at the height of it was just give them a little look, which, you know, you knew exactly what that look meant. You're getting too close to me, and they, oh, sorry. You know, they back off. And that's the social disapproval mechanism. But what's so interesting is there is that group. There is a group within our society all the time who are more selfish than the rest of us, who are constantly held in check by peer pressure.
That is fascinating. But obviously, all the social disapproval in the world isn't going to stop some people, the real hardcore of that.
Sure. And one of our great problems throughout the pandemic was how visible that was. I mean, I've said this already, but it mattered so much. That, you know, you'd hear all these people coming to radio programs saying, oh, but I see these kids out and they're hanging off each other down by the canal, or they're doing, and of course, but they were visible. You know, I mean, throughout this whole thing, I've been working at home in the upstairs room at the front of my house, which is a fascinating place to sit, actually, if you do my job, because I can see the front doors of about 10 houses on the other side of the street. And I knew that one of those 10 was a non-compliant house, and 9 out of 10 were behaving themselves really, really well, because I was sitting watching it. So I'm analysing...
Your own little lab experiment.
Yeah, no, I'm analysing my data, and if I look past the screen, I was watching exactly what I was analysing on the screen. But of course, everyone's seeing the one house out of 10 that was actually having a little party when they shouldn't have done, and 7 or 8 people showing up with cans. You know, it was happening, but it was very much a minority.
Young people got a lot of stick.
They did, yeah.
You think very unfairly?
I do think unfairly, yeah. They were more likely to be non-compliant, but they have much more reason to be. So let me explain what I mean by that. One of the things that's really frightening about our data is what it's done to people's mental health. There's huge diversity. Some people will actually tell us their mental health is better than it was prior to the pandemic. There are some people who it's taught them a load of lessons about living their life. It's made them adjust a whole load of things. It's made them think more about what matters to them. They've actually, as a result of the kind of upheaval, psychological upheaval that it's produced, they actually think it's improved their mental health. And there's a surprising number of them. It may be as much as a quarter to a third of the population thinks this has actually improved their mental health, which is extraordinary when you think about it. However, the cost is much, much bigger.
Sorry, because it made them think more about...
It made them reevaluate.
Reevaluate, yeah.
And it probably brought people closer with their families as well. Now, in some cases, that was a good thing. In some cases, it was not. Right? But for many people, it was. And we can see that in the data. Now, I've got to be a bit careful. I'm saying a quarter to a third. Well, if I ask that question at any point of people about whether their mental health's improved over the last 1.5 years, 2 years, well, for a lot, it would have done anyway. There are some people who, if you ever ask them that question, they always like to think they're better than they were a year or two ago. It's just this kind of natural human optimism. So I don't want to overstate the phenomenon. But there are definitely people who are there, and they're quite a sizable minority, who are saying, well, the funny thing is, actually, in a way, this has done me a lot of good. I feel kind of mentally better. Now, this is the thing I really want to say, though. There's a much larger group for which that isn't the case. There's a much larger group whose mental health has gone south, right? And they are overwhelmingly and disproportionately young adults. And when you think about it, I think it's clear why. You know, that's a time in your life, you're expanding your horizons, you're forming relationships. What matters to you more is friendships than family relationships for a large proportion of that group. They are finding themselves, they're forging an identity, they're trying to decide what they're going to do with their lives. You know, everything is about progress and motion, right? And moving their horizons to it and moving to other places. And all of a sudden, bang, down it came, right? And it was cut off from, and we could see that in the data. There's an absolutely huge effect. That the people who were being made miserable by the pandemic, ironically, were the people who it was least risky for. So the older people and the vulnerable, the older vulnerable people were the people under threat from the disease, but the people who were suffering the mental burden were disproportionately young adults. And that effect is huge. I mean, I have a chart that I put up in front of people, and quite literally they look at it. It shows mental health effects by age, and you see people looking and go, whoa. You know, you are looking at more than a third of our young people basically saying their mental health has gone south because of COVID.
It's going to be a real challenge for us.
Yeah, it's a really, really big thing. Yeah. So when people talk about the non-compliant to young people, you've got to contextualize that. There is no, you know, I studied people's decision-making, you know, and I can write down models of how people make decisions, little mathematical models, and they're quite predictive, they're not bad, right? And there is no model you can write down that says, if I feel that way, and I'm trying to decide, am I going to push the boundaries of what I'm supposed to do, right, that it's not going to affect it. It absolutely is. Right, so yeah, of course young people pushed the boundaries more as soon as they arrived. Of course they were less compliant. But that's because they were the people who were suffering. Yeah. And that's why.
Okay, so since January, you've been running this data, or collecting this data, presumably at a level we've never done before in this country in terms of trying to discover what people are doing on a day-to-day level.
I'm not aware of it ever being done anywhere before. Wow. I mean, we adapted a method that we stole from well-being research. So this whole idea of these day reconstructions where you get people to live yesterday, it's about trying to study people's daily well-being, because you follow up with questions about how people felt during the different episodes, and then you add it all up, and it's a way of studying what drives people's mental well-being. And there's this kind of lovely strain of behavioural research that's all about well-being that uses the method. And what we'd realised was we could take this method and use it to study how people were responding to COVID. So that's what we did.
Can you take this and help us in our next big behavioural challenge, which is going to be climate change and the massive behavioural changes we're going to be asking people to make? Yeah,
so we come on here to, you know, what I hope we get out of this that's more positive. We have an expression in our house, we call them corona bounces. positive things that have come out of the pandemic, and there have been some changes to our habits and things that we prefer and things we've discovered we like, we never knew we liked. All these things we call them corona bounces. I do hope that one of the corona bounces we get is, as a community and a society, and even a global community and society, that we are better able to fight climate change because we have fought this disease and we've learned lessons from doing it. And one of them is about how to solve collective action problems. It's about how people will actually behave if you give them the pathways they need in order to see why they need to make some sacrifices. So as an economist, as a trained economist, there's one thing about climate change that I simply think doesn't get talked about enough and we don't know enough. And that is, it's going to be incredibly costly to make the changes we've got to make. They're really, really large changes, and it's going to be really, really costly.
You mean personally costly to people's individual?
Yeah, it's going to be, it's expensive. It's costly to all of us. We have to change our lifestyles. We have to stop buying cheap stuff. You know, we're going to have to, our food bills have to go up, our transport bills have to go up, our energy bills have to. Why? Because we're having to invest huge amounts in new systems. Now, in the long run, there's a lot of people will tell you, in the long run, it's going to be economically better, and that argument is reasonable and can be made. But in the short run, we have to make some sacrifices, and we're trying to make those sacrifices for the public good. Right, so guess what, guys? We're in another collective action problem, right? And we've just learned a bit about trying to solve those and how to communicate to get people to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And I don't think, as of now, I don't think the message has been absorbed well enough about how big the change is and how costly it's going to be.
You don't think we're communicating well on climate change now?
No, I don't, no. But you know, I think that's going to change.
Is that in itself a behavioural issue, though, that it is so huge that people just, people are kind of almost afraid to face it or afraid to compute?
Yes, but there's also great diversity within the population. There's a minority that really have absorbed how big the change needs to be, and that minority is growing all the time. So the reason I'm quite optimistic is because the message, you can see the message sinking in. So looking at the data, I can see people getting it more and more and more. And it's definitely being helped by the extreme weather events that are happening around the world and how they're being reported, and people are going, if I had any doubts that this was real, I can see now that it's real.
And they're being linked in a way that possibly they weren't up until this year even. Yeah. They're being linked to climate change, those extreme weather events.
So once the message really gets in about how big the solution has to be and more focus gets onto it, then we get into this business, right, how do you drive that collective action problem? And how do you do it in a fair way? Because if it's going to be really expensive, right, well, that's fine for someone like me. You know, I'm a professor with a good salary and a lovely house, and you know that's okay. I can put up with paying more on my food bills, but not everyone is, you know, a middle-class professional who can afford to be paying more on their food bills. So we have to do something about that. We have to, and that again, there's a lesson from behavioural science there about if you want to solve these collective action problems. Well, what if I have a collective action problem where I've got some people who are much better off than others, or I've got some people for whom the sacrifice is bigger than others? We're not all making the same sacrifice. It's bigger for some people. So how do I then solve it? How do we put a fairness mechanism in to help the people who have to make the largest sacrifice?
Well, that's just transition, isn't it? But, you know, that's
Right, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put a different kind of language on this.
Yes. I was just going to say that's not something that people have bought into as or trust, really, as a concept.
Right, I'm trying to get people to think about it in a much more personal way about, well, if I've got a farmer here whose entire livelihood is going to have to change as a result of this, and then I've got somebody who's an urban person here who's got to make these changes, and we look at, you know, how do we do this in a fair way where one is not going to have a go at the other, and it's not going to say, right, I withdraw my cooperation because they don't have to do anything, but I do. That's where we need to get to, is to get that argument about what's the fair way to do it.
Yeah, but isn't the bigger problem here, as we go into this challenge, is that, you know, you have an evil twin. You know, not everybody is going to be pulling the same way in this, because there are massive vested interests who presumably draw on exactly the same kind of science that you are looking at, the same kind of data you're looking at, to persuade people or to undermine those big public messages.
Yes, they do. And in my more pessimistic moments, I worry about that. And in some other moments, I get pretty angry about it too. Because once
you ever been offered a job by you know, a business interest or
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, someone who has my skill set could make an awful lot of money by going into things like marketing and lobbying and so on. But one of the things that's really interesting about that is I have an awful lot of colleagues around the world who do the kind of science I do. Almost none of them take those private sector offers. Right? And the reason is because they're scientists. You know, they're fascinated by things. They want to study stuff. You know, all I want is enough money and comfort to be able to study what I want to study. And most of my colleagues around the world are like that. So you're right. There's actually large companies around the world who try to buy behavioural scientists precisely because they can see that from a kind of marketing and selling stuff point of view, and also from a fighting political battles point of view, where, You know, they may not necessarily have right on their side, and they may just have the bottom line that they're staring at, right? They want those people, but they can't get them because those people don't want to do that. And long may that
can't all
continue.
be angels now. Every
No, they're
behaviourist
not. No, but it's really interesting. So actually, the only big companies I know who've actually managed to hire some of the world's behavioural scientists who are like good ones. I mean, ones who are publishing in good scientific journals, who are good academic scientists. The only companies I know that have really managed to get those people are Google and Microsoft, and right, they have managed to attract them.
who have the kind of data that we can only
Right.
imagine for
So
those scientists to work.
It's attractive for the scientists, but it's really interesting what they've had to do to get them. So what they've essentially done is they've said, right, we're going to set up behavioural science labs, and we'll attract people in, and the way we're going to do it is we say, you can come to us and you can do behavioural science for our company, and we'll let you have a lab, and you can run whatever experiments you want, you can publish it wherever you want, you can do whatever you like, as long as you're there when we need you for some consultancy. And that's what they've had to do to get them, is basically say, look, we'll set you up what is essentially a really, really well-funded university lab, but provided you're next door, so we can talk to you when we want to. And that's the way they've done it.
Yeah, it just kind of slightly chilling though to think with like what you've told us there today on, you know, the kind of data that you can glean and what you can do with that data and how powerful it can be in the right hands and how powerful it can be in the wrong hands. It's...
Yes, I agree with that. I try not to think about how much money I can make sometimes, because I mean we've talked here about COVID, but in normal times I spend quite a lot of my time studying how people make major financial decisions. So I'm looking at how people do things like choose mortgages and loans. And the reason I look at that stuff is because households lose enormous amounts of money by making poor financial decisions. And we try to study, well, look, how can we make those decisions better? How can we put information in front of people? How can we frame those decisions in ways that allow them to make better decisions so they don't lose thousands to these companies? And that's what I do during normal times. So when you look at that data, you can see how it is that powerful vested interests basically are taking households for a ride on a pretty regular basis, because they understand how the decision is made and what the product is better than the person who's buying it.
Yeah. Misinformation, disinformation, and how have you been able to track the impact that that has on decision-making through the pandemic, if we go back to our conversation about the pandemic? And in particular, I was interested in the vaccination levels, because we obviously famously have some of the best in the world. And how come that hasn't affected us in the way that it has impacted in other countries?
So there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we had a tiny anti-vaccination movement before this all started. And a lot of those other countries didn't. So the anti-vaccination movements in places like France and Germany and so on are much, much bigger than they ever were in Ireland. So if you do public surveys, you'll find there's a real substantial skepticism about vaccination in a lot of European countries, which we didn't have. So that's one of them. But I would also go back to our size and our communication. The anti-vaccination type misinformation is far more fertile in a country that has got political polarization and media diversification, right? Because in both cases, you can find bits of the mainstream media that will entertain the argument. Even if they don't believe it, they'll put the people on, they'll entertain the argument, they'll try and get a row going between the people, all this kind of stuff. Because as soon as you have competitive, fractured media, those forces are there, right? And we're very fortunate, we don't have that. In these circumstances.
Not everybody would say we're very fortunate.
No,
and the media landscape.
And they'd have a point, because you know there are some real advantages to having a more competitive media environment. But when you're facing a global pandemic and you need to get messages out to everybody, where you're trying to coordinate everyone's behaviour to essentially be the same, to all adhere to the same guidelines and all do the same things, and preferably take this vaccine, and this is why, having really dominant mainstream media is hugely helpful. Right? It just really is hugely helpful. So I think...
So there was really no mainstream media place that entertained the anti-vax...
Correct, but we can also see that even the most vaccine hesitant are the people who are least likely to watch mainstream media. It's a far more powerful thing than age. So everyone said, oh, look, younger people are less willing to take the vaccine than older people because they're less at risk from the disease. That effect was there. It's not very big. You can measure it, statistically significant. Massive effect that's there is the people who are vaccine hesitant are people who don't watch mainstream media and don't read mainstream newspapers.
But do you know, consume other media like the YouTube and the Facebook?
Some of them yes, some of them no. Some of them had simply got to a point in COVID where they just switched everything off. And those people were much more likely to be vaccine hesitant because they weren't getting the message actually about how effective they were. So one of the things we discovered was much more important than misinformation and what people were reading on social media about misinformation about the vaccine. It'll cause this, it'll cause that, and stuff that was just not right. Much more important was whether people had absorbed the message about actually how good these vaccines were. And the mainstream media, of course, ran that story at some length. Brilliant, we've got the vaccine, and it looks like it works, and look how much it works, right? And the people who'd absorbed that message, and this gives you an idea of why behavioural science is a little bit different from just doing surveys, because what we actually did in our study, so the thing we do every 2 weeks where we're tracking people, at the end of the study, after we found out what did they do yesterday and all the stuff, we actually asked them some multiple choice questions about the vaccine. So we'd say, you know, do you know this, do you know that? We'd ask people questions. So we could see, are the people who are knowledgeable, who've absorbed the messages, does that affect their behaviour? And if so, what behaviours and where does it affect it? This kind of thing. So what we could see was the people who are following the mainstream media and the people who understood how effective the vaccines were, they were the people who were going to go out and get them. And the hesitant people were the people who'd not absorbed the benefits. So it wasn't actually that they'd absorbed a crazy message about how risky it was. In fact, there's hardly any difference. There's little difference, not much, in how risky hesitant people think the vaccine is versus the people who are going to go and get it. They know there's a small risk there. There's not much difference there. Right? The real difference was had they absorbed the message about how good it was, how much it protects you from the disease.
Wow, wow, that is fascinating. And is there any other data there around generally how vulnerable we are to disinformation?
Katie,
oh.
you have
10
10 minutes.
minutes. Okay, will we throw it out then if we only have the 10 minutes? Yeah. Well, you did interrupt me in the middle of it, Katrina. Is there any other data, like how vulnerable are we as a population to disinformation?
We're all surprisingly vulnerable to misinformation. And part of the reason we're vulnerable, so there is now a behavioural science of misinformation. I should stress it's not my specialist area, but I do go to talks of people whose specialist area it is. We're all much more vulnerable to it than we'd like to think. And one of the ways you kind of know this is, I bet everyone in the room at some point fell for an April Fool joke and said to themselves, I cannot believe I fell for that. I cannot believe
that spaghetti doesn't grow on trees.
And the truth of the matter is that you only have to, the psychology is fascinating, you only have to read something that is plausibly true, even if later you discover it isn't true or you decide it probably isn't true. You only have to read something that's plausibly true, and to a degree it sticks. Your memory lodges the point, and even though you then later decide that's not true, I should dismiss it, right? It stays there. And it's a fascinating thing. It's something to do with the way we evolved to process and collect information and what's said to us and so on. But in a modern world of media where so much information and so many stories and ideas spread so quickly, it's a problem. You only have, if it is plausible, it sticks a bit, which is why we are vulnerable to those April Fool jokes.
Yeah, and also vulnerable. I always think that this comes up actually if you're reporting on politics a lot, that people, in the run up to a budget or an election or whatever, politicians obviously fly a lot of kites of things that they say they're going to do or that they have done, or they to test the water on things. And you discover afterwards that people are absolutely convinced constantly that these things actually happened and were part of policy and were introduced in law. And
and anyone who's been involved in a big media story and knows there's an untruth there that was eventually uncovered will forever tell you that lots of the population never got the bit where it was uncovered and only ever absorbed the untruth. Yep. So that the thing sticks, that mud sticks, even when there's been a huge story afterwards. Say, oh, do you know what? That wasn't actually true.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it lodges.
It does. Okay, a few minutes left. I'm just so fascinated by every single aspect of what Pete is telling us. Anybody with a question? Yeah, please. Hang on, I think we can actually get it on mic so we can have it for the tape.
Thank you. That was a fascinating talk. I was interested in your statistic about a third of the people who hadn't met people for 48 hours. And I was wondering, do you have any kind of baseline for that, which says that was all pandemic related, or does that reflect a problem with loneliness generally?
That is a great question, because you have exposed one of the weaknesses in our research, because of course we only started doing this study partway during the pandemic. In fact, we had to do a lot of persuasion to say, look, if behaviour is our best defence, we really, really should be measuring it properly. So we started measuring people's behaviour properly and how much they were going out and about. And you're absolutely right. That means I don't have baseline data from before the pandemic. So is it possible that 1/3 of the population was not meeting up with anyone from outside their own household over a 48-hour period prior to the pandemic? It's possible. I doubt it, but that's just my own personal view. So what we then do, of course, is let's look at how it spreads across the population and see if there's any suggestion. So is it only among people who are single and older? And, because that would be, if there's a loneliness explanation there, that would be where you'd look. And one of the things that's fascinating that I think actually in this talk I haven't said enough about is the plurality of what you see. What's amazing is a lot of those people are young people. Right? What's amazing is a lot of those people are family people who are in their 30s and 40s who would normally be out and about and are dropping kids off and are meeting other mums at the school gate, or they're also working people. This includes going to work, right? So that third, none of them in that third of the population are going anywhere near a workplace and meeting someone, because that would count. They would then have met someone from outside their household. So when we look at it, you are right, we don't have a proper baseline. So we don't know what the target to get back to is that would be normal times. And maybe that target's too high because we've got too much loneliness in the population. We want it to be even lower. I'm pretty sure 33% is too high. Right? So yeah, we've looked at it. But the other reason I really like your question is because I haven't said enough about how different people are. Right? So when we look at the pandemic, it has been incredibly different for everybody. If I look at my lifetime, I think of the big events. They've come along almost every 10 years. The Berlin Wall coming down was a big one. 9/11, financial crisis, pandemic. About every 10 years, some massive news stories come along that's impacted my life. I think the pandemic's affected it more than any of those other three. Right? It's got to everybody. It's changed everybody's daily behavior. It's changed all of our relationships with each other. It's just this huge story for everybody. But it is so different for different people, depending on what their job is, depending what their family structure is, depending whether they've personally suffered some kind of bereavement or loss as a result of it, as many people have. It's hugely different. And we see that in the data. When I look at those people who aren't going out and about, around a quarter of the population at the moment, if you say, how worried are you personally about the pandemic still? On a 10-point scale, about a quarter of the population will still give a 9 or a 10. And of course, those people are much more likely to be in the 33% who aren't seeing anyone outside their household. Then you've got another quarter of the population who are almost over it. So they're kind of saying, well, look, 4 or less. And then there's a whole bunch of people in the middle. But the amazing thing is, as we've watched the average fall from somewhere around 7.5 to more like 6 out of 10 for how worried you are personally, there's this huge spread that's hardly changed at all. Right, where we've got these people who are right up at the 9 and 10 area who are still restricting their behavior, still not meeting up with people, and then people right down the bottom are much more likely to take risks. I don't know if anyone's here has gone to it yet, but I mean, just down at the main festival gallery, down in the centre of town, there is an exhibition there, which I think is called House of Memory, if my memory works well enough, where people have just written a couple of sentences. It's a really lovely exhibition. They've written a couple of sentences and put it all up on this kind of wooden structure because it's got a kind of architectural metaphor that goes into it, where people have written what the pandemic means to them and what they'd like to say about it on all these cards, and they've all gone up on this wooden structure. And going around it this morning, it's brilliant if you want to go see it. Go around it. I'm not being paid to do this, by the way. I'm just saying it. As a behavioural scientist, for me, there's absolute meat and drink. I loved it. And just walking around, what's incredible is the range. Some people are describing specific events that have had profound effects on them. Some people are hugely positive and optimistic about how it's changed their lives. Some people are really depressed by what's occurred. And you can tell, actually, again, as you look around, you can tell it's more likely to be younger people just from the way they're writing it and what they're saying they could or couldn't do and what their plans had been and have now been shattered. It's a fascinating thing. So this huge difference. And one of the things I've been trying to get across throughout this, and largely struggling to in the public domain, to be honest, is we have this idea of the public mood. We're obsessed by where the public is at on average. You can kind of understand why politicians are and why the media want to report that. What's incredible about this pandemic is how amazingly different it's been for everybody, that you've got people who've been affected by it in hugely diverse ways. And that actually is going to be one of our problems going forward. Because we've now got to forge a way out of this that everyone agrees with. We've got to decide when we finally settle with an equilibrium and we have a level of this we've got to put up with, and how we put up with it, and how we try to live our lives from now on. And notice I'm trying not to say go back to normal, because my data say, actually, most people don't want to go back to normal. There's a group who do, but they're a minority. Most people want something a bit different. Some people want something a lot different. Right? And we've got this huge diversity of what's happened to people during the pandemic, from all the way from the 33% to staying at home to the people I saw out on Eyre Square last night while I was walking past. Right? And we've all got to decide, what are our new norms going to be? What do we coalesce around to go forward from here, given we're going to clearly have to live with a kind of equilibrium level of threat? So sorry, that's a hugely long answer to a quite simple question, but it gave me the opportunity to get that in because I think that's a really important point.
Any other audience? I have one last thought as you were saying that there. We're faced. Oh, yes. Andrew.
The impact of the border in your research and about compliance and how the border counties maybe were different.
Yeah, so we did see some modest differences in compliance in some of the border counties.
Sorry, can I ask you, did you, the surveys you're doing, are they just in the Republic, not, do you have people in Northern Ireland?
They are, which is kind of interesting actually, because some of my northern colleagues are distressed by how little data they have compared to the data we have. So they've often tried to make inferences by assuming that what's going on in the south and what's going on in the north must be kind of similar, because they don't have data that's as good as the data that we were operating off, which goes right back to that stuff I said at the start about how good we were about pulling data in initially.
Yeah,
So when it comes to the border counties, we can see somewhat different compliance. But in a way you'd expect that, because you've got different behaviour over the border. Now, although I'm saying they don't have great data, they have good enough data we could see that behaviour in Northern Ireland and behaviour in the Republic was different. I've travelled once to the UK, because I hadn't seen my mum for ages, so when the restrictions were lifted, I took a ferry and I went over to the UK to go see my mum. And I was really surprised how big the difference in people's behaviour was. As soon as you travel to the other island, you actually find people are, on average, less cautious. They are happier with people getting too close to them, and you can just see it all around you. And you know, if you go into a restaurant, it is not necessarily the case that someone who serves you will be wearing a mask. There is, you know, less fuss at the doorway about how it's all operating and being done. And that's kind of fascinating. So when it comes to the border counties, you would expect a bit of that UK attitude to rub off, right? And we can see a little bit of it in the data, but it's not as big as you might think. And the primary reason that places like Donegal have had such a difficult time is just because they're close to areas with very high levels of infection and it's travelling across the border to them. I mean, that's the primary reason. But you do see some difference in behaviour. Now, in case you're sitting there thinking, by the way, I'll nail my colours to the mast a little bit here, but in case you're sitting there thinking, well, you know, they're behaving differently in the UK, lucky them. I mean, the thing to bear in mind in all of this, when I'm talking about how well we've done internationally, per head of population, we have less than half the death rate that the UK's had. That's the trade-off we made. So as a European country, we were on the cautious side. We went for stronger public health measures than most other European countries, but the result of it, when we did it quicker, which was absolutely vital, we acted quicker. But it is genuinely true that when you look at the data, the result of that is we have fewer than half the number of deaths per capita that the UK has had, and that you can look at that directly related to the public health measures that we took.
Okay, I think that's, we're over now, Katrina, aren't we? Just, can I say, we are so glad that we have you on our side rather than on the other. Absolutely fascinating. Dr. Pete Lunn, absolutely brilliant.